Welcome to Be Connected podcast by Safa.
Episode 2. How do group psychology concepts explain the intensity of conflict between Sunnis and Shias?
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we are going to be tackling the Sunni-Shia divide in Islam. It's a fascinating subject. Even if you're not, a religious scholar or anything like that, I think the insights that we are going to uncover today have relevance for everybody, no matter what your background is. We've got some really fascinating excerpts for you. They cover both historical and psychological perspectives on this age-old split between these two groups.
Yeah, and it's that blend of history and psychology that makes this a really rich topic. So we're going to go beyond just the surface level today and explore not just what happened, but why it matters and how it reflects kind of broader patterns of human behavior.
Exactly. So often, you hear about this divide in the news, and it's usually just reduced to sound bites and oversimplifications. So our goal today is to equip you with a more nuanced understanding, something that you can actually take away and apply to your own life.
Yeah, exactly. Because whether we're talking about religion or politics or even just our everyday interactions, understanding how groups form and why conflicts arise. It's crucial for navigating, all the complexities of the human experience.
For sure. Okay, so let's set the stage here. For those who might be unfamiliar with Islam, can you just give us a quick breakdown of the basics? What exactly is the Sunni-Shia divide?
Sure. It's essentially the oldest and the largest division within Islam. It dates all the way back to the 7th century. And to put it in perspective, about 85% of the world's 1.6 billion Muslims are Sunni, while Shias make up about 15%. Now, both groups share the core beliefs and practices of Islam, but they differ on certain theological points, interpretations of Islamic law, ritual practices, and the structure of religious leadership.
It's interesting you mentioned the structure of religious leadership because that seems to be at the heart of the historical root of this divide, right?
Absolutely. The split originated from a disagreement over who should succeed the Prophet Muhammad as the leader of the Muslim community. After his death in 632 CE, Sunnis believe in following the Prophet's traditions, known as the Sunnah, and consider themselves the orthodox branch of Islam. They base their practices on what the Prophet said, did, and tacitly approved of, all as recorded by his companions.
So for Sunnis, it's about following the established path, the precedent set by the Prophet himself. That makes sense. What about the Shia perspective? Where do they diverge?
Shias believe that Ali, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, was the divinely appointed successor. Their interpretation of certain Quranic verses and events during the Prophet's life point to Ali's unique spiritual authority and leadership.
So right from the start, we see two distinct interpretations of the same foundational texts and events. And I imagine this difference in belief about leadership had major ramifications.
It did. It led to a period of intense political and social upheaval within the early Muslim community.
And that's where the story takes a really dramatic turn, right? I mean, Ali's reign was pretty short and tumultuous, ending in his assassination.
Yeah, Ali's caliphate was marked by conflict and only lasted 5 years before he was assassinated in 661 CE. Then, tragically, both of his sons, Hassan and Hussein, were also killed under controversial circumstances. They were seen by Shias as the rightful successors, and these events had a profound impact on the development of Shia identity, particularly the concept of martyrdom.
Okay, now this idea of martyrdom, that's something I've always found so fascinating. It's so central to Shia Islam, but I never fully grasped its psychological impact.
Well, imagine the psychological weight of those historical events. The rightful successors unjustly killed. It cultivates this sense of persistent injustice, of loss, and fuels a narrative of oppression and resistance.
So it's not just a historical fact, it's an emotional anchor for Shia identity.
Exactly. And these events actually led to the emergence of various branches within Shia Islam, each with their own interpretations and practices. But the largest branch, the Ithna Asharis, believe in 12 divinely appointed imams, starting with Ali, each carrying on the Prophet's spiritual authority.
12 imams, that's a lot to keep track of. But isn't there something unique about the 12th imam?
Yes, the 12th imam, Muhammad Ahmadi, is believed to have gone into hiding in the 9th century, and the belief in his eventual return is central to the Ithna Ashari faith. He's viewed as a messianic figure who will return to establish justice and peace in the world.
Wow, so this belief in a hidden imam who will return, that's got to shape their whole worldview. It adds a layer of anticipation, of hope for a future resolution to injustice.
It does, and this belief ties back to that sense of historical grievance and the yearning for a just world. A world where their interpretation of Islam prevails is a powerful motivator, both spiritually and at times politically.
You know, it's striking to see how historical events and theological interpretations can intertwine so deeply with people's psychology, their sense of self, and their place in the world.
It's a perfect example of how history isn't just a collection of facts. It's a living narrative that shapes identities and worldviews, and it's something we'll see even more clearly as we dive into the psychological aspects of this divide.
And that's where things get really interesting. We've laid the historical groundwork, but our sources also point to some fascinating psychological factors that help explain how this divide persists even centuries later.
Right, because it's not just about theological debates or historical events. It's about how our minds work, how we form group identities, and how easily we can fall into this us versus them thinking.
Yeah, and sometimes those us versus them categories can form even when the differences are pretty minor, right? Our sources use a great example of how kids describe themselves. Like if you ask a group of kids to tell you about themselves, they'll often highlight what makes them unique. I have a red bike. I'm the tallest in my class. It's like we're wired to focus on what sets us apart, even within a group we already belong to.
That's a great analogy. And it's a fundamental aspect of how we categorize ourselves and others. We naturally emphasize what makes us distinct, even when those distinctions are relatively small.
So if we apply that to the Sunni-Shia divide, it makes you wonder how much those theological differences, even minor ones, get amplified because they become markers of group identity.
Precisely. And when those differences are layered on top of centuries of historical baggage, political tensions, and social divisions, they can take on a whole new level of significance. It's not just about disagreeing on an interpretation. It's about what that disagreement represents for each group's identity and sense of belonging.
It feels like we're already seeing how history and Scientology are so intertwined in this divide. But our sources go even deeper into the psychology of group dynamics. They talk about this thing called in-group, out-group dynamics, which sounds pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, it is on the surface. It's that basic human instinct to categorize people as either part of a group or outside of it. And you know what's fascinating? This instinct has deep evolutionary roots.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these evolutionary roots. How does wanting to belong tie back to survival?
Think about our early ancestors. Sticking together in groups meant better protection from predators, more success in hunting and gathering, and a higher likelihood of passing on your genes. So over time, we evolved to favor those within our group and be wary of outsiders.
That makes sense. Safety in numbers and all that. But how does that translate to something as complex as the Sunni-Shia divide?
Well, even though the reasons for belonging to a group might be different today, that basic instinct to favor us and be wary of them is still wired into our brains. It can unconsciously influence how we perceive information, judge individuals, and even react to situations.
So you're saying that even if we're not facing physical threats like our ancestors, this in-group, out-group instinct can still shape our social interactions and beliefs.
Exactly. And it can be especially potent when those groups are linked to deeply held beliefs, cultural identities, or, as in the case of the Sunni-Shia divide, historical conflicts.
It's like that quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. We may not be living through the same events, but those historical narratives and the emotions attached to them can still resonate within these groups.
Precisely. And that leads us to another powerful psychological concept, group polarization. The idea is that when like-minded people gather and discuss their beliefs, those points tend to become even more extreme.
Wait, so you're telling me that simply talking with people who agree with me can actually make my opinions more extreme? That's kind of alarming.
It is. It's like an echo chamber effect. Imagine two groups, each with their own interpretation of historical events, their own set of grievances. Within those groups, those narratives and interpretations get reinforced, often without exposure to alternative viewpoints. The nuances get lost, and the divisions deepen.
I can definitely see how this plays out online. Think about social media algorithms. They often feed us content that aligns with our existing views, creating these online echo chambers where certain narratives get amplified. Is that what you're getting at?
Exactly. And this can happen within any group, not just online. It's a dynamic we see in political parties, social movements, and even within families and friend groups. The key is to be aware of it, to actively seek out diverse perspectives, and to challenge our own assumptions.
That's such an important point, especially in today's world, where it's so easy to get caught in those echo chambers. So we've got this in-group bias, this tendency toward group polarization. Are there any other psychological factors our sources highlight?
There's one more, and it's a bit of a paradox. It's the power of a common enemy. The idea is that when groups face a shared threat, it can actually strengthen their internal bonds and increase solidarity.
I can see the logic there. Like if you're facing danger, you band together for protection. But how does that play into the Sunni-Shia divide? It's not like they're facing a shared external enemy, right?
Not necessarily a single unified enemy,
Mm-hmm.
but there can be a shared sense of threat, of being misunderstood or marginalized by those outside the group.
That makes sense. And I bet this sense of shared threat can be heightened during times of conflict or political instability, when tensions are already running high.
Absolutely. And those external conflicts, even if they're not directly between Sunni and Shia groups, can exacerbate the existing divide by reinforcing that us versus them mentality.
So it's like this complex interplay of historical baggage, theological differences, and these powerful psychological forces that we all experience, regardless of our religious beliefs.
Or cultural background. Exactly. And what's fascinating is that these same dynamics play out in countless other contexts. Think about sports rivalries, political debates, even disagreements within workplaces or families. The labels might change, but the underlying psychology of how we form groups, perceive differences, and react to perceived threats, that's a universal human experience.
That's a really powerful point. It's like, by understanding the Sunni-Shia divide, we're not just learning about one specific conflict, we're gaining insights into the very nature of human social behavior.
Exactly. And those insights can be incredibly valuable for navigating our own lives, our relationships, and our understanding of the world around us.
So with all this in mind, let's bring it back to the Sunni-Shia divide specifically. How do these psychological principles actually manifest in the real world? How do they shape the way these two groups interact and perceive each other?
Well, for starters, think about that tendency to focus on differences. It can make even subtle disagreements seem much larger than they actually are.
It's like that example with the kids. One kid mentions their red bike, and suddenly everyone is comparing bike colors, even though they were all playing together just fine before.
Precisely. And in the context of the Sunni-Shia divide, those differences might be interpretations of specific verses in the Quran, variations in ritual practices, or different understandings of religious authority. These distinctions, while important, can overshadow the vast amount of shared beliefs and values that unite both groups as Muslims.
It's like that old saying, they can't see the forest for the trees. They're so focused on the differences that they miss the common ground.
Exactly. And then you add in historical grievances, political tensions, and social inequalities. And those differences become even more charged. It's like those echo chambers we talked about, where certain narratives get amplified and the divide deepens.
Our sources gave some interesting examples of this, like the way certain historical events are remembered and interpreted differently by each group. The death of Ali and his sons, for example, is a source of deep mourning and a symbol of injustice for Shias, while Sunnis might view those same events through a different historical lens.
Yes, and those different interpretations of history can fuel a sense of us versus them, even if both groups share a common desire for peace and justice. The classic example of how historical narratives can shape our understanding of the present and our perceptions of other groups.
It's like those sporting rivalries, where each side has its own version of history, its own set of heroes and villains. It adds this emotional layer that can make it hard to see things objectively.
And just like in those rivalries, any new conflict, any act of violence or discrimination can reignite old wounds and reinforce the existing divide. It's a vicious cycle.
So if we're being honest, it sounds like bridging this divide is a pretty daunting task. But are there any glimmers of hope? Are there any examples of Sunnis and Shias working together to overcome these differences?
Absolutely. There are many individuals and organizations dedicated to interfaith dialogue and understanding. They recognize the shared values and humanity that connect them, and they're actively working to build bridges and challenge the narratives that perpetuate division.
It's encouraging to hear that there are people actively working to build bridges. It gives me hope that even amidst these deeply rooted differences, there's a possibility for understanding and even collaboration.
Yeah, it's essential to remember that the vast majority of both Sunnis and Shias desire peace and coexistence. The challenge lies in overcoming centuries of ingrained narratives and fostering empathy across those historical fault lines.
You know, as we've been diving into this topic, I've been struck by how much these psychological principles apply, not just to this specific religious divide, but to so many other conflicts we see in the world today.
Absolutely. The Sunni-Shia divide is a powerful case study, but the underlying dynamics, the in-group, out-group bias, group polarization, the power of a common enemy, these are all human universals.
It's like you said earlier, these dynamics play out in politics, social movements, even in our personal relationships.
Right. Think about how easily we form opinions about entire groups of people, based on limited information or stereotypes. Think about how quickly online debates can escalate into angry exchanges. These are all manifestations of those same psychological forces we've been discussing.
So what's the takeaway here for our listeners? What can we do with this knowledge to navigate these dynamics in our own lives?
Well, first and foremost, awareness is key. Recognizing that these biases are inherent to the human experience is the first step towards mitigating their impact. We need to be mindful of how easily we categorize people, how quickly we jump to conclusions, and how readily we accept information that confirms our existing beliefs.
It's like that classic advice to seek first to understand, then to be understood. Are there any practical steps we can take to apply that advice in our daily lives?
Absolutely. Actively seeking out diverse perspectives is crucial. Read books and articles from authors with different backgrounds and viewpoints. Engage in conversations with people who hold different opinions than your own. Challenge yourself to consider alternative interpretations of events.
It's about stepping outside of our echo chambers, both online and offline, and exposing ourselves to a wider range of ideas and experiences. It's not always comfortable, but it's essential for growth and understanding.
Exactly. And it's not about abandoning your own beliefs or pretending that differences don't exist. It's about approaching those differences with curiosity and respect, recognizing the shared humanity that connects us all.
That reminds me of something we touched on earlier, the power of a common enemy. You mentioned that even though Sunnis and Shias might not have a single external enemy, there can be a shared sense of threat or marginalization.
Right. And this brings up a crucial point. If focusing on a common enemy can strengthen divisions, then focusing on shared goals and values can help bridge those divides.
So instead of dwelling on what separates us, we should look for those common threads that unite us. Whether it's a shared concern for social justice, a desire for peace, or simply the recognition that we're all part of the same human family, those shared values can be powerful forces for connection and collaboration.
Exactly. And this applies not just to religious divides, but to any situation where groups are in conflict, whether it's political polarization, racial tensions, or even disagreements within our own families. Finding that common ground is essential for moving forward.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. We started by exploring the historical roots of the Sunni-Shia divide, uncovered the psychological forces that shape those divisions, and landed on some really valuable takeaways for navigating conflict and fostering understanding in our own lives.
We've learned that history and psychology are inextricably intertwined, shaping how we perceive the world, interact with others, and make sense of our own identities. And while the Sunni-Shia divide is a complex and multifaceted issue, the insights we've gained today have relevance for anyone seeking to understand human behavior and build bridges across differences.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought. We've talked a lot about the power of shared goals and values. What are some areas where you see potential for collaboration between different groups, even those with a history of conflict? And what steps can individuals take to foster that collaboration in their own communities?
That's a great question to ponder. As you continue your own deep dive into the complexities of the human experience, until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep